Muslim Ummah elsewhere in the world. Fourth, the emergence in the 20th century of a number of major social and political movements for Muslims in Indonesia, based on different interpretations of Islam, meant that it became very difficult for Indonesia's nationalist leaders to select any one of those movements' interpretations of Islam as the official national understanding of Islam. In responding to the politics of Islamic identity in Indonesia since the 1920s, it was easier for Indonesia's leaders and safer for them politically to prioritize and valorize difference and diversity and plurality, and thus, or pluralism, thus preventing the emergence of a united religious political movement with a single set of values and norms that could threaten political authority. In the 20th century, particularly in the post-colonial world after World War II, the diversity and fragmentation of Indonesian Islam began to diminish. It encountered a rising form towards uniformity of belief across the Muslim world. Based on the notion of a united global ummah, a world community of believers, and tied to a growing enthusiasm for scripturalism, calls for assertion of Islamic identity and reform of unorthodox practices reached Indonesia, which for a long time had been the farthest point in the Muslim world from the heartland. And it there disrupted the patterns of Muslim identity and gradually began to turn Indonesia's long-standing fragmentation into polarization. And this is a process that is not resolved, it's still continuing. We have to see where it leads. Transition in the face of global change from fragmentation to polarization, which has had all sorts of dramatic implications for Indonesian politics beyond just the world of religious belief. Now, as what I've just said suggests, in the middle of all this has always sat the state, both the pre-colonial states of the Rajas and Sultans, the colonial state of the Dutch, and the post-colonial governments that have ruled Indonesia since then. For all of these governments, including the pre-colonial Muslim governments, Islam has always presented some sort of political challenge, sometimes just because the ulamas represent an alternative pole of authority. So this was an implicit and given and continues to be the case. And this is true of all the post-war independent states in Southeast Asia with Muslim populations. The governments that have ruled Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, Singapore, Thailand, and the Philippines since independence have all been secular governments, regardless of what sometimes some of them might say. They are all secular governments, and that's true essentially for all Muslim governments in the world, whatever they say. I'm not saying they're not religious, they're not pious, they're not Muslims. I'm saying that the way the governments function is identical to any other government. The nature of the modern state is secular regardless of the religion of those who operate it and live within it. Each of those states in Southeast Asia has been concerned to influence the trajectory, content, and style of the legal traditions of their Muslim citizens to match their own wider policy objectives. And they have been usually very effective in controlling the legal traditions of Muslim populations, leaving aside rebellions and regional secessionist movements. By and large, they have been able to control the application of Islamic law. Southeast Asian governments are, like all the other governments before them, motivated to select and reinvent Islamic legal traditions because of a perceived need to respond to the challenge they see implicit in Islam as a rival pole of temporal authority. In developing legal policies for their Muslim communities, they are preoccupied by the question of the extent to which Islam should be recognized as a source of formal state-sanctioned law, enforceable by state institutions. So the concern is not so much about the content of Sharia, but to what extent the content should be taken and placed into formal state law, enforceable by state institutions. They're different things. Southeast Asian governments have often, though not always, answered the question by using recognition and enforcement of Sharia norms in state law as a way to actually marginalize the legal traditions of Muslim communities. In other words, enforcing Sharia in law will often have the effect of marginalizing the ulama populations and marginalizing Sharia as an independent source of law. I'll explain why that happens. It seems a paradox, but the rest of my paper will try to explain this to you. In doing so, the Southeast Asian governments have chosen forms of intervention in Muslim legal traditions that differ between them and differ in the states over time, but they all share common strategies of institutional and ideological restriction and control, often through coercion and co-option using state institutions. This is true of Indonesia, where the modern republic has been skilled at using its own bureaucratic and legal institutions to insert control over the interpretation of revelation. It has done this by close management of the administration of a restricted selection of Islamic legal traditions, interpreting them and often altering them when it turns them into law, whether that is law relating to banking or whatever field it may be, the law relating to wakaf and so on. It interprets, it selects, and then it turns it into regulation. And in the course of doing that, it transforms them, as Abdullahi An-Naim would have told you in his recent lecture. As will be seen, this was the strategy the modern Indonesian state inherited from Dutch colonial rule, of controlling interpretation of Islam through law. It was state policy for much of the Orba, a period when Islam was constructed as a potential political threat to the centralized authoritarian and nationalist state the military had created. Now, of course, overt repression of political Islam diminished very significantly after Suharto's fall in 1998. Many of the Orba restrictions placed on the expression of Muslim identity, political and personal, were lifted soon after Suharto lengse ke Prabon. Since then, much attention has been paid to a so-called Islamic revival that's taken place in Indonesia. Popular calls for greater recognition of Sharia are identified as characteristic of this, and the challenges they present for post-Suharto governments, including the current government, have been the subject of much analysis. It is commonly said that the Islamization of law in modern Indonesia is a direct challenge to the secular state. There is little doubt that many garis keras conservative proponents of Shariaizasi, legal Islamization, do wish to make precisely such a challenge. They do wish to challenge the secular state. Equally, many of those who oppose them see the hardliners' efforts to do so as intended to create some form of Islamic state based on the formal implementation of Sharia. I don't think they're going to be successful in that, but that is the ambition, ultimately. Both of these groups, the hardliners and their opponents, see this form of legal Islamization as the opposite of Indonesia's essentially secular democracy and its religiously and culturally plural society. The opponents of legal Islamization see this secular democracy and plural society as a fundamental part of the political bargain that was struck in 1945 that led to the creation of a united republic. And therefore, they say this pluralism is essential to the coherence of the nation state. The opponents of legal Islamization therefore rely heavily on the Pancasila, and the first Sila in particular. So we have a sort of polarization of ambition between the two extremes of the garis keras conservatives and the liberals at the far end, with democracy at the end, a liberal democracy at the end of the liberal part of the continuum, and some form of Shariaization and an Islamic state at the other, but most Muslims in Indonesia somewhere in the middle, not at the ends. But the result of this increased focus on legal Islamization, Wycliffe's argued, has been a polarization of the Muslim community over the last decade or so. Now, I would argue that actually the situation, this is the commonly held view, but I would argue the situation is not so clear cut. I think it's a little more complicated than that. It's not always necessarily the case that recent efforts at legal Islamization have actually reduced the state's influence over the religious life of Muslim Indonesians. That Shariaization does not push the state out. There are two reasons for this. In the past, the state may have stood above and dominated civil society under Suharto. But now, in the post-Suharto era, the state is in the middle. It's one of the players that is trying to mediate and moderate the pro-democracy camp, the anti-democracy camp, and at the same time, external forces. So the state is a player in these processes. It's not just garis keras versus liberal. There is also the state in the middle. In other words, the proponents and opponents, those who support and those who object to Islamization, all look to the state to mediate in their favor. The strategies for and against Shariaizasi in Indonesia are always expressed in terms of state regulation of Islamic traditions, new laws, not the removal of the state. The strategies of the supporters of Shariaizasi are marked by the use of secular structures of the state, the legal system, to strengthen their positions. Conservative Muslim groups have ironically sought to use the legal mechanisms the state has developed to restrict Islam in their efforts to force the state to accept a normative religious role and adopt the conservative norms they propose. In other words, the conservatives want to reassert their position exactly through the bureaucratic agencies of the state that they saw as having repressed them in the past. It's kind of ironic that having been repressed by the state under the Orba, the conservatives now look to the state for Shariaization. It was their enemy, but it's also their mechanism. As a result of this, the state's capacity to intervene in the religious lives of Muslims in Indonesia has actually expanded and not been reduced by Islamization. A pattern is very evident of the state responding to pressure from Muslim groups to expand the scope of Sharia in Indonesia, but doing so in a way that keeps Islamic legal traditions within the formal legal, administrative, institutional framework of the state. MUI, for example, is an NGO. Majelis Ulama Indonesia is an NGO, but actually it's not an NGO. It's an independent entity set up by charter under Suharto, but it is actually a Quango. Quango is a quasi-autonomous non-government institution. In fact, what it means is an NGO that depends on the government, as MUI does. MUI depends on the government for a revenue stream, for a budget it receives, and for lucrative monopolies that the state has granted it in relation to determining Islamic values. So even an agency like MUI that's nominally independent is actually dependent on and relies on the bureaucratic and institutional systems of the state. The result of that is that although Islamic legal traditions have expanded beyond the narrow, limited private law area they were restricted to under Sukarno and Suharto, post-Suharto regulation and bureaucracy has expanded with them. And so the state has actually retained interpretive authority and a power of intervention over the expanding world of Sharia. So a key issue now confronting the Indonesian state, and it's the Indonesian state that, whether you like it or not, always makes the final decisions about the application of Islamic law in Indonesia because it has the power. The key issue now is whether Indonesia's historical religious diversity, including within Islam, should be dismantled, and a single state-endorsed understanding of orthodox Shafi fiqh should be formulated and applied by the state, which is basically what conservatives want. This would not be a quick or easy task, given Indonesia, although the world's largest Muslim society, has no official mufti who speaks with legal authority, unlike in Malaysia, Singapore, and Brunei, and given also the intense social and political competition between major Muslim organizations. But it is clear that many of the major debates come down to attempts to persuade the government to endorse one or another understanding of Islam on the one hand, and the responses to that from Muslims who oppose that position and non-Muslims as well who insist on pluralism. In fact, Indonesia is actually the only regional exception for having resisted the seductive lure of state-endorsed doctrinal and organizational uniformity. It is the one country in the region which has not selected a single entity to determine the application of Islam, at least not completely. Its diversity, combined with the fact that it is weak states that have always ruled Indonesia, no matter what anybody thinks, the governments in Indonesia have always been weak governments, and which lack the strength, therefore, to select from competing streams of Islam, these factors have actually protected Islamic diversity in Indonesia until now. But it is clear that uniformity and enforced orthodoxy, which is the path most other states with Muslim populations in the region have followed in order to manage Islam, is a future option that Indonesia might take. And I want to warn against that today. I want to warn against uniformity of orthodoxy. I want to warn against a streamlined, systematized control of interpretation that is in the hands of the government, because I think that would be a very big mistake, and that Islam's strength in Indonesia is its diversity, even if that is sometimes kacau. The best way I can see to make that warning is to give you the example of the state in Southeast Asia that has been the most successful in using the coercive power of the state and law to impose a uniform, conservative, orthodox understanding of Islam. And as you'll see, I think it is a very repressive, stifling model that is entirely incompatible with democracy. So fasten your seatbelts while I take you on a trip to Brunei, because I think Brunei is actually, when it comes to Shariaization and Islam, is the exact opposite of Indonesia. So Brunei is an absolute monarchy, one of the only ones left in the world apart from Saudi Arabia and the Pope in the Vatican. And it's certainly the only absolute monarchy in East Asia. The current Sultan, Haji Hassan al-Bolkiah, is the king. He's also the Prime Minister. He's also the Minister of Defense. He's also the Minister of Finance, and he's the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade. His son is a senior minister in his office. You get the picture. The Sultan is the head of state. He has full executive authority and exercises sweeping emergency powers that give him complete control of government in Brunei. And he's exercised those sweeping powers since he came to the throne in 1967. He is one of the richest persons in the world. And after Elizabeth II in England, he is the longest reigning monarch in the world. Brunei has a parliament, but is a rubber stamp body that can only advise, not decide. It has only 20 members, and they are all appointed by the Sultan. Under the constitution, if they are disloyal or disaffected towards him, they can be removed. The constitution in section 84B says that, wait for this, no criminal or civil litigation may be initiated against the Sultan for acts or omissions done during or even after his rule in any capacity, official or personal. In other words, he is constitutionally above the law. Section 84C of the Constitution says that no decision of the Sultan can be taken to the courts, and the Sultan cannot be required to provide any reasons for his decisions. In other words, there is no opposition and there is no political alternative to the Sultan in this tiny kingdom of not even 500,000 people with just 5,000 square kilometres of territory, which is the only oil-rich state in Southeast Asia. Brunei is also one of the very few states in the world that officially describes itself as Islamic. And since independence in quite recently, 1984, the Sultan has been able to expand and deepen his political power. He has built on political and ideological institutions he inherited from the colonial system, including in particular the equation of royal power with Islam. For example, the Sultan is the official guardian and protector of Islam and tradition in Brunei. He is also, by law, the head of Islam in Brunei. He is the chairman of the National Majlis Ulama, or Majlis Agama, and the Mufti, the office of the Mufti, is under the Sultan's control as part of his Prime Minister's department, and he, of course, is the Prime Minister. So the National Mufti sits in his office. The Sultan was also responsible for formulating the country's official ideology, Melayu Islam Baraja, which means Malay Muslim monarchy, which he officially proclaimed in 84. This is, as he says, quote, a blend of Malay language, culture, and Malay customs, the teaching of Islamic laws, and the monarchy system, which must be esteemed and practiced by all. So the absolute authority that I've described to you of the Sultan and the absolute monarchy, which gives him complete power above the law, is formally enshrined in the state ideology Melayu Islam Baraja, which equates sovereignty and political legitimacy with the Sultanate, Islam, and Malay identity. And this ideology has allowed the Sultan to take over the legal system and use Islamic religious authority to repress all dissent and legitimize his rule. Now, I want to show how this works by looking first at Fatwa in Brunei, and then I want to look at the Sharia codes the Sultan introduced. So first to Fatwa. And here you will see a very dramatic difference to the situation in Indonesia, where we have a very large number of fatwa giving bodies. And while MUI may be recognized by the government as a partner, MUI is still not a national mufti in a legally recognized sense. However, in Brunei, the state maintains a monopoly over the issue of fatwa because the authority is the exclusive right by law of the Majlis Ulama Islam and the Sultan under the Religious Council and Qadi's Court Act. In fact, it is a criminal offence to issue a fatwa in Brunei without state permission. And this is the case in some of the states of Malaysia too. And it is ensured that in Brunei, as in Malaysia, official fatwa in Brunei face no competition from fatwa produced by Islamic organisations. There is no debate about fatwa. A big contrast again to Indonesia, where there is constant debate about fatwa, and fatwa compete. There are two categories of fatwa in Brunei, binding and non-binding. And the Sultan, under section 42 of the relevant legislation, can order the Majlis Agama to issue a fatwa if he wishes. Fatwa that are selected and published in the National Gazette become automatically legally binding on Muslims. The Majlis Agama refers to fatwa that have been gazetted and become legally binding as having been diundangkan. So I think we can think of fatwa in Brunei that are gazetted as a form of legislation. In other words, the Sultan can direct the Mufti to issue a fatwa that becomes effectively undang-undang. Any fatwa, I'm sorry, I'll just move forward here. The Mufti's fatwa making powers are under the control of the Sultan, because under the law, the Council and the Mufti can refer questions directly to the Sultan where special grounds exist. If the Sultan makes a decision, the Mufti must issue a ruling in accordance with it. In other words, the Sultan has the power to direct, order, and overrule the Mufti. So the Sultan himself, not a scholar in the sense of the way the Mufti is nonetheless the pinnacle of authority and control in fatwa making in Brunei, whether they are binding or non-binding. As I said before, it has been an offence in Brunei for decades to issue a fatwa without permission of the Religious Council, the Majlis Ulama. It's also a criminal offence under other laws. And these penalties have completely eliminated any chance of even unofficial competition to state-endorsed fatwa. It also stifles any debate in Brunei about Fiki and interpretation of the scriptures. In other words, Fiki in Brunei Islam itself is interpreted and decided not by the ulama, but by the sultan. It's an unimaginable situation in the context of Indonesia, where nobody really resolves debate about fiqh ever. So all of this was made very clear in 2013 by the issue of the Perintah Kanun Hukuman Jenayah Sharia, or the Brunei Sharia Penal Code by the Sultan. This controversial new code includes hudud punishments, including stoning to death, amputation, and whipping for serious crimes, including zina and other related sexual offences. The 2013 code was followed in March 2018 by the Sharia Court's Criminal Procedure Order. This set out the actual procedural rules necessary to prosecute the new hudud offences and apply the physical punishments. It has, for example, very detailed instructions on how to carry out execution by stoning and so on. Both codes were signed into law by the Sultan, who, as I said, constitutionally has absolute power because of the state of emergency, and that has the power to make any orders whatsoever that he considers desirable in the public interest under the Constitution. So he can issue these simply by signing them off. In other words, there is no debate. In December 2018, notification of commencement of the laws was gazetted so that the codes would commence in their entirety, including the amputations and executions by stoning, on the 3rd of May in 2019. Now, as I'm sure most people listening today are aware, the introduction of these codes created a very major international controversy. And the Sultan and the codes were criticised by multilateral institutions around the world. And this criticism triggered a business boycott campaign that began in 2014 and was renewed again in 2019. And this was directed personally at the Sultan because he is so closely identified with the codes. And it was led by prominent celebrities such as George Clooney, Ellen DeGeneres, Elton John, Richard Branson, and so on. And it targeted hotels owned by the Sultans. Many businesses around the world joined in this boycott. In May 2019, in the United States, the Brunei Human Rights Bill was introduced by Representative Ilhan Omar, herself a Muslim and a controversial figure in the US, along with 19 other representatives. This bill is still before the House. It was referred to the House Committees on Foreign Affairs and others, and is going through the processes. It is a Magnitsky-style bill. Magnitsky-style bills are bills that are intended to place economic sanctions and travel bans directly on individuals who are seen as responsible for human rights abuses. So this Magnitsky-style bill would, quote, authorize the President of the United States to impose sanctions on any Brunei government officials responsible for implementing provisions in Brunei's penal code in a way that constitutes gross violation of human rights, including laws that call for the death penalty for offences such as adultery and consensual same-sex relations. So this aggressive international criticism of the codes, the boycott, the threats of Magnitsky sanctions meant that although Brunei announced it was going to implement the code in 2019, almost immediately after that, the Sultan announced an informal and indefinite moratorium on the death penalty. So it seems that while the code is in force and being applied for minor offences, the hudud phases, the executions and amputations, have been postponed indefinitely. In the 1960s, Joseph Schott wrote that in terms of subject matter, the hold of Sharia is weakest or non-existent in areas such as criminal law. But recently it's been observed that by other commentators that From the 1970s, the number of countries applying Islamic criminal law slowly has increased. I think there has been a significant shift, particularly in the 1980s, towards attempts to revive and introduce Islamic criminal law, and certainly that's been true in Southeast Asia. However, Bielefeld has observed that, quote, even those who defend the legitimacy of the hudud punishments, in theory, actually prefer to avoid implementation of those punishments, invoking practical obstacles to their reintroduction. In other words, even those who support hudud punishments don't quite want to go so far as to see them being applied. This is, again, also true for Southeast Asia. As we know, there are now 3 Islamic criminal codes on hudud that have been passed into law in the 3 majority Muslim states in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Brunei. But in all these places, while these criminal codes have been introduced, amputations or executions have never taken place. The codes introduced by PAS in Malaysia, in the rural northeastern states of Kelantan in 93 and 2015, and Terengganu in 2002, were initiatives at the state level by an opposition party. The PAS Sharia codes included amputation, stoning, and even crucifixion. They were opposed by the ruling party UMNO, which refused to enable their implementation because of an issue of constitutional division of powers allowed the ruling federal party to obstruct actual implementation of the state laws. So the 2 PAS codes remain on the statute book as laws, but they can't actually be enforced. PAS closely followed developments in Brunei. It sent a delegation to study implementation of the Sultan's Sharia penal code order, and has used the Sultan's actions in Brunei to reinvigorate debate in Malaysia about reviving its own codes. So that's Malaysia. As in Brunei, codes on the books but nothing done. And of course, we all know about the efforts by governments in Aceh to introduce Kanon Jenayah, allowing stoning to death for adultery in Aceh. And we also know this has not happened. It has not eventuated, and could even result in central government intervention if it did. However, compared to Malaysia, responses to the introduction of the Sharia penal code order in Brunei were quite muted in Indonesia. Some praised it in general terms as part of a wider trend of legal Islamization in the region. Others, like the international critics, condemned it for breaching human rights norms and for following antiquated and disputed conservative interpretations of Sharia to justify the punishments. But the developments in Brunei did not contribute to new legal Islamization in initiatives in Indonesia the way it did in Malaysia. Now, while all these codes, Brunei, Malaysia, Indonesia, are all efforts at codifying Islamic criminal law norms, and so have quite a lot in common, the Indonesian and Malaysian codes were different. They are products of conservative local governments, and they were implicit challenges to the authority of central national governments. In Terengganu and Kelantan, PAS introduced the codes to challenge the UMNO government in Kuala Lumpur. In Aceh, it was a challenge to the national government to introduce such a law. But Brunei's Sharia penal code order is very different. Far from being a challenge to the national government, the code is a direct decision of the Sultan himself, the government, who pushed hard for years for its introduction and continues to say it will one day be implemented. So I come to my conclusion now. What is the result of the takeover of Sharia, of Islamic law, by the government, that is the Sultan in Brunei? What is the result of the conflation of Islam, national identity, and the Sultan's power in Melayu Islam Beraja? Certainly, it has created the imposition of a form of Sharia that's mandatory for all Muslims. Certainly, it has created an enforced religious orthodoxy that follows a particular conservative interpretation of the Shafi madhab. Certainly, it has led to uniformity in Islamic interpretation, with other Islamic sects actually banned from Brunei. It has meant that no theological challenge to the conservative interpretation of the Shafi madhab is possible in a system where the Sultan is head of Islam and alternative interpretations are virtually treason. As matters stand, Islamic law in Brunei is political in nature and co-identical with the Sultanate. It is a central component of the political legitimacy of an absolute monarch. And so the administration of Islam in Brunei is not a reflection of the traditions of Sharia. Rather, it is part of a wider mechanism of repressive state control, and that is true of the Sharia codes. Any questioning of state policy on Islam is a form of political dissent and subject to severe criminal sanctions. Indeed, any form of social organising not approved by the state through registration is also a criminal offence. It is therefore almost completely impossible for Islamic movements or any other groups to express any alternative understanding of Islamic legal tradition in Brunei, let alone organise and engage in public life. In other words, uniformity and the end of dissent has also meant the end of debate, and that has meant the end of intellectual Islamic scholarship. I would argue that Brunei is an extreme example of what can happen as a result of a current trend across Southeast Asia for Islamist groups looking to the state to legislate to enforce Islamic law through state laws. Eventually, asking the state to legislate Sharia leads not to the rise of the ulama, but to the grant of almost complete control over fiqh to the state. And when this happens, Islamic law becomes a weapon for the state to entrench power, as the Sultan has done in Brunei, constructing his Malayu Islam Baraja system and the Sharia codes at its centre to entrench his dynasty and future-proof it against accusations of immorality, profligate expenditure and public unrest when one day in the future, maybe not so far off, we all drive electric cars and the oil money runs out. This supports what your previous speaker, Abdullahi An-Naim, has said. And I quote from him, because what he says, I think, really summarizes what I'm trying to say. He said that any principle of Sharia that is enforced through the coercive authority of the state stops being part of the normative system of Islam and becomes an expression of the political will of the state. This does not mean that Sharia principles cannot be a source of state law, but the outcome of the enactment and enforcement of principles by state institutions becomes always a matter of secular law and doesn't reflect Sharia as the religious normative system of Islam. What that means, to finish today, is that the proponents of legal Islamization in Indonesia and elsewhere need to be very, very careful, because they might think they are controlling the state when they call on the state to legislate Sharia. But actually, what they usually do is simply give the state even more power. Islamization can lead, and it very often does lead, to the state taking over Islamic thought, Islamic interpretation, Islamic fiqh, because it has to select in order to make laws. And that is why I believe that Indonesia's current model of limited state involvement, of free and chaotic debate, is the best example of true Sharia in the whole Southeast Asian region. And I would very much hope that it remains that way, and that you resist efforts to legislate Sharia, because you end up marginalizing Sharia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pak Tim. Very interesting and very compelling and also intriguing conclusion that you provide to us, that Indonesia is the best example how to implement the Sharia by limiting the state involvement in that. And I think you correctly, and I think by providing example of Brunei, that the formalization of Sharia will only lead to the authorization of political regime to oppress and to become authoritarian government. Thank you, Pak Tim. And please write your question in a Q&A. But this is two questions, Pak Tim. One of them is from your student, Zajan Mutakin. He said, while Halak in one of his book, the impossible state basically argues that Islamic law and modern nation state is a self-contradictory concept. Islamic law and pre-modern have never been unified, but modern nation state necessitated unification or codification. In the context of Indonesia, as you said, what is the best way to accommodate the characters of Islamic law while at the same time accommodate the interests of modern state? And the second question I mentioned here is...
Can I answer that one, Pat Jam? Because
yeah, please, Pat.
I can't keep it in my head, sudah pikun.
Okay, Pak Tim.
Just do satu demi satu.
Right, okay.
It's a really interesting question. One of the fundamental problems about the so-called Islamic State, this ambition of the proponents of Islamization, is that it is fundamentally a hollow concept within the scriptural sources. It doesn't really exist in any significant fashion in the scriptural sources because it was unnecessary during the period of prophecy during Muhammad's life. And so attempts to determine an appropriate political system are retrofitting. It's a matter of going back into the past and trying to find justifications for or indications of an ideal Islamic political system in the scriptural sources, or by doing what Professor Hooker used to call mining the fiqh. In other words, cherry picking from the fiqh to try and find an explanation of the Islamic State. And there have been experiments in creating a modern Islamic State, most notably, of course, in Iran, which is a very interesting experiment. But it has to do so really in the absence of any clear scholarship on that point. What I mean by that is the sources are so limited. There's a great deal of scholarship, but the sources are so limited. So one scholar has described this as the fantasy of the Islamic State, meaning that we don't really know from the scriptural sources what an Islamic State would be like, and there are simply a range of competing attempts to construct an idea of what one would be. And that means that the struggle to try and create a state that you can call an Islamic state that functions in the way secular states do in the modern era is nowhere near being resolved. The reality is, if you create an Islamic state that resembles the 7th century, as organizations such as Islamic State tried to do, what they're really doing is creating this sort of imagined fantasy about the 7th century. They're not really able to implement any clear notion of Islamic State that's got a scriptural basis. So the alternative is then to try and adapt the secular state to make it Islamic, which is what is generally done. And that's a very different thing to an Islamic state. It's tinkering with the modern secular state. And the problem you come across here is that as soon as this modern secular state starts legislating Sharia, it has to do what all secular states do when they make law, which is they have to pick from a source of law, they have to draft it into a regulation, then they have to give it to the law enforcement authorities, the police and the courts to implement. And it just becomes, as our name says, another secular state law that happens derived from Sharia norms. And usually by the time all that selection has gone on, it's a very, very long way from the ulama and from the fiqh. And it often can be used for quite un-Islamic purposes. And so I agree with Wael Halak's comment that Islamic law in the pre-modern era was never unified, and I would add that there was never any clear understanding of what the ideal Islamic state looked like. And so Islamic law and the modern nation state are very difficult things to mix together, oil and water. And what usually happens is that the secular state model, which is how all countries operate basically today, dominates, and Sharia ceases to be Sharia once it's legislated.
Thank you, Pak Tim. The next question is about.
Sorry, can I just add one thing, Pak Jam? Sorry, I'm not saying that you cannot pass laws that draw on Islamic norms. There's no problem with that. Yeah. It's possible to draw on Islamic norms in the same way that a Christian community draws on Christian norms, or should, or a Buddhist does. Yeah. The point is, you should not believe that by passing laws drawing on Islamic laws, you are implementing Sharia. Yeah. It's a different thing. And you should always be suspicious of the state, because the state is not an Islamic entity, and it is not an ulama, and it will not be applying the fiqh. It just selects. Sorry, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Pak Tim. The second question is how the development of Islamic law in the international world, especially in the ASEAN sphere, is it, probably I will add explanation on that question. Is it political or is it a struggle for Muslim for their identity? Thanks.
Well, they're the same thing, really, because a struggle for identity is a political struggle.
Yeah.
It can, of course, be, it's a cultural struggle, it's an intellectual struggle, but identity is a political thing. The way we think of ourselves, the way we act on our understanding of ourselves, that is politics. Everything really is politics. So as soon as a person seeks to assert some aspect of their identity and want others to recognize it, you're into the world of politics, whether that's a Muslim wanting to be able to express Muslim identity, whether it's a Buddhist wanting to express Buddhist identity, whether it is, for example, an LGBT person wanting to be accepted publicly as an LGBT person, whatever, whether it's a black person wanting to be accepted in a white community, all of that is asserting identity, and it's political. And so it is inevitable that as Islamic identity grows in this post-colonial world, that it is intrinsically political, and it plays out in elections, politicians, and of course law. Because if the moment you start talking about politics, you're talking about law. Law regulates politics. Politics produces law. Politics means policy. The end outcome of policy is law. So asserting Islamic identity means politics, and it means law. And that works in a democracy. And the reason it works in a democracy is you don't have one voice. You have multiple identities contesting with each other. And that means you have Muslim and non-Muslim voices, but it also means you have Muslim A, Muslim B, Muslim C debating as well. And so multiple identities who may be incompatible have to bang together and sort out their differences through the democratic and political process. In other words, what I'm saying is there is not one Muslim identity to develop and express. There are multiple identities. And democracy provides a way in which those identities can negotiate with each other and find ways of expressing themselves without harming the others. Religious, non-religious, race, ethnic, sexual. That's why democracy is actually very compatible with Islamization, because it allows the fiqh to be debated and for compromises to be reached, which is what Islam has always been about in many ways. Now, if you try to assert a single identity, this is Islam, and Islam is the only identity, then you are going to come into conflict with all the other identities, and you either lose because you're a minority, or you wipe out the other identities because you're the majority. So that's the choice between democracy and autocracy. In other words, what I'm saying is, to try and make this simple, the expression of identity is political. Politics is best managed through democracies. And that means that developing Islamic identity is better done in democracy, unless, of course, you're the Sultan of Brunei.
Okay, thank you, Pak Tim.
There's only one of them.
Very interesting comment. And the next question is, Dear Professor Tim Lindsay, I would like to know why we talk about Islamic law. Most of the emphasis only to aspect of politics and power, but other aspects such as environment, technology, sociology, even economy, which is also important in secular system, is not quite influenced by Islamic law.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have any comment on this?
Yeah, I talk about politics and power because it's really interesting. There are plenty of areas. Theoretically speaking, there is no area of human endeavor that cannot be influenced by Sharia. And we see that very clearly through Islamic banking, Islamic finance, the economy Sharia, for example. So what I'm talking about has implications right across the board. I'm not restricting it.
171 juga kan, 174 nih.
Pak Amsal, Amsal tolong di-mute.
Yeah, so, but the question of whether Islamic law is applied to the environment, which is a burning question that needs more attention, I agree. What it means for technology, what it means for the economy, for banking and so forth, that is all a question of politics and power.
Yeah.
Because you can come up with whatever rules you want for an Islamic banking product, you're still going to have to get it approved by the Day One Sharia in the bank. The Day One Sharia in the bank is regulated by laws passed by Indonesian institutions that go back to Bank Indonesia and to MUI itself as well. So the whole framework for that is determined by law, which is politics and power. So you are right. There are many other aspects that we could have discussed. You're lucky I didn't. I would have gone for hours. But ultimately, the big question is whether Islamic law is applied is about whether the government decides to do so or not. So I'm trying to look at the mechanisms by which states make decisions about regulating Islamic norms.
Right. Thank you, Pak Tim. This question from Riri Khoriroh. My question to Pak Tim in relation to women's issues. It seems that the pressure to regulate Sharia laws for women's behavior and conduct is much higher in Indonesia, especially through local regulations, such as on hijab, restricting mobility of women, etc. What is your observation on this issue?
Thank you very much. Thank you for all your questions that are really good. I feel like I'm being interrogated by the police. I didn't do it. I'm innocent. They're very good questions. Thank you very, very much.
Yeah.
I don't think the focus, there certainly is a focus in Kanun and Perda around Indonesia on women's issues, their behavior, their dress, sexuality, and so forth. That's true. I don't think that is unique to Indonesia. I don't think it's unusual in Indonesia. Wherever you go around the world, when Islamization of laws is taking place, there is always a strong focus on women, especially in the initial phases. And there's a whole range of reasons for that. The first is that generally norms about behavior of women are more conservative in Muslim communities than they are in Western communities, for whatever reason. And that means that globalization tends to create patterns of behavior that Islam wants to modify. So it's quite often a response to globalization. That's one of the reasons, because it's an obvious change. The second reason is that whether you like it or not, developing countries tend to be patriarchal in nature. Some would say that's part of the developing process, that you move away from patriarchy over time. But in any case, many Muslim countries are developing countries because they were colonized and stripped of their resources. And therefore, because they're developing countries, they tend to be more patriarchal. And therefore, that means that women's behavior is of great concern to the patriarchy. The ulamate is, in most countries, dominated by males. And so restraining the behavior and limiting and restricting the behavior of women is something that patriarchies like to do. And the ulamas in many developing countries are no exception to that, unfortunately. Third reason is that historically, family law issues and the place of women have always been seen as a sort of last bastion of Sharia law. So when you look at the way colonial powers intervened in Islamic communities, they would strip away Islamic criminal law, they would strip away Islamic economic law, but the last thing that they would touch was family law. And so traditions of family laws, for example, relating to divorce and so on, tend to be stronger than all the other areas of Islamic law because colonial powers did the least change them the least, and therefore questions about the status of women are one of the areas where traditional Islamic values have always been strongest. So you put all those three things together, and when you have an Islamic revival, it usually starts targeting women. And that, I think, is unfortunate, and I think it also gives Islamization a bad name because it's usually seen as regressive and patriarchal. I would just observe in relation to the hijab that I've always thought that enforcing the wearing of hijab ran contrary to the whole point of wearing a hijab, which is choice. But that doesn't seem to worry the patriarchy. Thank you.
Thank you. Pak Tim, before I read further the question, I have one question that I would like to ask you.
Please.
A week ago, we have a discussion with Malaysia about the state accommodation of Islam. But the result of the accommodation of Islam in two states have quite different results. In Indonesia, the Islam and state accommodation results in moderation of religion, that you have to trying to accommodate different states, the different interpretation of Islam and so on like that. But in Malaysia, more and more now, the accommodation of the state about Islam is becoming more conservative, Salafism. Do you think why this happened in these two countries?
It's really very, very simple, I think. It's state capture. So Brunei, I use Brunei because it's an extreme example of state capture of Islamic debate. Malaysia is sort of on the spectrum between Indonesia and Brunei on that, in that state capture took place a long time ago, not to the same extent as in Brunei, because Malaysia has a different political system, it has a democratic model. But nonetheless, it has muftis that have monopolies on fatwa making. It has criminal sanctions to ensure the removal of rival fatwa in different states. There are fatwa can be gazetted as laws, diundangkan as well. So it's sort of in the middle. And that's because if you look at the three countries, the Sultan has absolute authority over Islam. The Malaysian government government agencies exercise a greater degree than Indonesia, but a good deal less than Brunei. But they have, the state has become a more important determinant of Islam through the various religious councils and the mufti than in Indonesia. Whereas in Indonesia, the state has not captured Islam. It is a mechanism at this stage by which the competing voices seek to implement their own interpretations. So the state is not the final voice on Islam in Indonesia yet. There is no legally empowered state mufti. There are no penalties for rival fatwas. There are not restrictions on interpretations of, at least of the Sunni belief, although I think the Shias are a different category. So I think it comes simply down to state capture. As long as you don't have state capture, you will have diversity in debate, and that ensures a degree of pluralism. Once you have state capture, the debate is narrowed down, and that reduces pluralism. So I'm arguing, I don't think Indonesia is in a tipping point or a dangerous point, but I'm saying that the more you allow the state to legislate Sharia, the less debate there is about interpretation, and gradually you move towards state capture. And that's dangerous because that's against the nature of Islam, and particularly the nature of Islam in Indonesia.
Thank you, Pak Tim.
By the way, can I just make a comment? But Imran Khotan put in an amusing comment that the Virgin Mary and Mother Teresa donned hijab. No issues have been so far raised. I think you're quite right, Pak. I agree with your comment. I think people should wear whatever they want to wear, and I don't think we should worry about it. I think that these sort of these perceptions by people that the number of people wearing hijab tells you something about wider ideological tendencies in society isn't completely untrue. I think it indicates nothing except that people want to wear a hijab. And if they want to, they should. And if I want to wear a hat, I'll wear a hat.
Right, yes. Hijab is tradition.
Look, it doesn't matter. People wear hijab for all sorts of different reasons, some traditional, some not. I just don't think it matters. I think it's a matter of personal choice what people wear. And I think it is ridiculous to legislate that.
Okay, good. Thank you, Pak Tim. Now, return to question by Miftahuddin Ahimi. This is dilemma for the democratic in a religious state like Indonesia. As the democratic norms allows everyone to express their voice to secure their interests, what is your opinion about using political identity in campaign in a democratic country?
Well, of course, I don't like it when people use religious identity and exploit it and manipulate it and misrepresent themselves and use explosive and controversial issues to try and attract votes, particularly when they do it by attacking minorities in order to gain advantage. But we have to accept that this happens in a democracy, because when you free up voices, when you give freedom of expression, freedom to organize, freedom of association, that is completely meaningless unless you give it to the people you dislike as well. It is not freedom of expression when people who agree with me can say anything they like and nobody else can speak. That is just repression.
Yes.
That is Brunei. So in a democracy, you have to accept that the voices will include voices you think are wrong and bad. That is what makes freedom of expression meaningful. So we must also accept that in politics, people vote for different reasons and politicians will try and exploit that. And we have to accept that in a functioning democracy, religious identity will be exploited in elections. What we have to do is develop the political maturity to see when that happens and to be able to say that politician is expressing a genuine view, and this politician is just lying to get votes in this area. Now, I think it's very interesting that studies of Perda Sharia by a number of different scholars have shown that the largest number of Perda are passed by non-Islamic parties.
Right.
That the largest number of Perda are passed by Golkar politicians. And that suggests to me that what we have there is an insincere manipulation of a political process for the vote, for vote catching. In other words, to ward off criticism from an Islamic sector, you pass Islamic laws as a defensive mechanism. That makes good political sense, but it's very bad for Islam and democracy. So my comment is, religious identity is always going to be used in democracies, and it's necessary that that's allowed to ensure freedom of expression and debate. But we need to be a lot more sensible and careful and mature in identifying it and knowing what's going on and not voting for people who exploit identity in that way. Unfortunately, it's been quite a successful tactic. And I think in the end, the voters need to think hard about what they're doing. But that's not a good reason to ban it.
Right. Thank you, Pak Tim. I think that's through the study of implementation of Sharia in some regions in Indonesia, actually proposed by non-Islamic parties to win the election.
Yeah, it's clear. It's clear.
Yeah. Next question, Pak Tim. Sorry, there's a lot of question and very varied. Now, Now moving to digital. For the last decade of Indonesian Islamic society, especially after the high access to internet, I can see the tend to more conservative in terms of religious interpretation and expression, including Islamic law. There are some findings that more conservative in social media. Based on your observation in Southeast Asia countries, do you see the same trend on them? The contribution of internet.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, just let me think for 1 second about the question. Yeah, okay. I think it is true that there is a rising social and moral conservatism more generally across the Muslim world, but that's true for the whole world. You could also say there is rising social and moral conservatism in the Christian world. And you can say there is rising social, moral conservatism in the secular world. Right around the globe, the world is shifting to the right.
Right.
So we have to be, I think we have to be careful. I hear this discussion a lot. Muslims in Indonesia have become more conservative. Yes. Muslims in Southeast Asia also, to answer your question, yes, become more conservative. But so have Muslims in Australia. And so have Muslims everywhere in the world. That is a shift. And in fact, everybody in the world, if you look at the populations, have become more conservative. Their right-wing governments have been voted in all around the world, from Trump to, well, I can keep going, the numbers are endless. Is increased conservatism in a Muslim community purely because of Islam? Probably not. It's probably because of wider global trends. How have those global trends spread? Probably in part through the internet. And I think the world has not sorted out what it's going to do about the internet. The proliferation of false news, the fixation on conspiracy theories, the rise of the right wing through effective use of the internet. I don't know the answers to that. I don't know anybody does, but I think it's a serious threat. So don't restrict your concerns about the internet and conservatism to the religion of Islam. I think that's a mistake. But I would also add one more thing, which is the internet has severely disrupted the traditional lines of communication and transfer of Islamic knowledge and thinking in a way that hasn't happened for centuries. And I'm referring here to what some Muslims like to call Sheikh Yahoo and Imam Google. Sheikh Yahoo and Imam Google are now the sources that people turn to when they want their fatwa. They might have gone to speak to their local alim in the past. They might have consulted the books, the publications of NU's fatwa, maybe in their local perpustakaan, but now people short circuit this. They jump past the traditional lines of authority. They jump past their parents as well, and they go online. And who knows who Sheikh Yahoo and Imam Google are? They probably a 19-year-old sitting in an apartment somewhere with no authority or knowledge whatsoever. And so I think whilst we have, yes, growing conservatism that's tied to the rise of the right and the internet, we also have the disruption of Islamic thought by fake, not just fake news, but fake fatwa, fake authority. And I think that's a bigger problem. Conservatism is not extremism. I was going to say it again. Conservatism is not extremism. They are different things. I have plenty of liberal friends. I have plenty of conservative friends. I don't really have any extremist friends. I hope. To be conservative doesn't mean you are extremist. I think the shift to conservatism worries me less than Sheikh Imam and Sheikh Yahoo and Imam Google, and the proliferation of extremism through unknown voices through the internet. And I think that concerns Muslim scholars in every community, that they are being cut out of the intellectual life of the youth.
Right. Thank you. This is direct question sent to my private message. the question is this, Fatim. Sorry. Do you think as a participatory, open, critical Islamic higher institution, such as UIII, will be capable of becoming strategic institution to transform Indonesia into a Muslim country imagined by the founding fathers? Fatim?
Well, I wish I knew what the founding fathers were imagining, because then I could answer your question. I always think what the founding fathers imagined is a little bit unclear. I do remember the founding fathers first voted on the Tujuh Kata,
Yeah,
the Piagam Jakarta, and then the next couple of days later removed it
yeah,
without a vote. So who knows what they were really imagining.
yeah.
But look, I actually think that's a very interesting question, because it raises the problem of the fact that the attitude towards Islam of the founding fathers and one mother at that meeting was, don't forget the mother, the attitude was unsettled and hotly debated and contested, and what actually went on with the Piagam Jakarta we'll probably never really know. So that's my point about this whole thing. Indonesia is so diverse, so fragmented, that there is no one single position, and that these issues are very, very difficult to deal with. They are about negotiating diversity. And I would call on you to do what the founding fathers ended up doing, whatever they thought individually, which was they worked out that the solution was to preserve diversity and pluralism and to avoid state capture. Because as soon as any one group wins the state, everybody else suffers. So I would say the vision of the founding fathers genuinely was, whether they liked it or not, the solution they came up with was pluralism, because it's the only way to keep this society together. Now, in terms of UIII, of course you can become a player, and that's why it's been set up, so that you can be an influential force and you can create a sort of institution that Indonesia has never had before in terms of Cendekiawan Islami, which is a mixture of public and private, in a sense, that sits between the state UIN system and the private universities and the secular universities, which can offer education at that sort of very high level, but which is still in touch with these debates. And you would have speakers who would come to speak to you who you would agree with. You would have speakers who are liberals, and you'd have conservatives come to speak as well. Because if you want to have a role in the future of Islam in Indonesia, that means the whole of Islam.
Okay. Good, Fatim. This is another question on the implementation of Sharia in Aceh. Do you see the same thing happen in Aceh, that the governor of Aceh more authoritarian as in Brunei because of the implementation of Sharia Qanun?
No, I think the situation in Aceh is different to the situation in Brunei. The circumstances are very, very different. You still have elections in Aceh. Okay. So Islam is still open to debate. It's true that the position on Islam is much more limited and restricted than anywhere else in Indonesia, but I think you'd be making a mistake if you thought there was no debate in Aceh about interpretation. There is a great deal. And for example, the proposal and then the defeat of the proposal through a lot of complex machinations relating to the Qanun Jinayah and the Hukuman Mati, and that whole process shows the differences of opinion and the extent of debate in Aceh. I think Aceh is an experiment, really, in the extent to which a modern state that is part, or a modern state entity, the government of Aceh, which is part of a wider unitary state Indonesia, the extent to which you can actually implement Islamic norms and engage in legal Islamization is being tested in a laboratory in Aceh. And in some ways that has worked because the government runs. Aceh is okay, basically. The system functions. In other ways, it's been bad. For example, the treatment of women, I think, is oppressive. I think the treatment of LGBT Indonesians is terrible. Human rights are a problem. Now, that's a choice that the Acehese voters, the majority of them, the government they put in, makes. But I don't think we've seen the end of this process. I suppose what I'm saying is this, that this is a debate. It is underway. It has been quite successful overall, but there are still serious problems, and it remains to be seen how this will work out. I'm not too worried about that as long as the democratic process remains strong in Aceh.
All right. So the issue is the democratic process that you can challenge, and also you can have a selection and elect the government that is best for you, Pak Tim, rather than
that's exactly right. And elections in Aceh are hotly contested.
Yes.
But imagine if the government there passed a law ending elections in Aceh, and then opposing one particular interpretation, then I think you'd have not just a problem politically for Indonesia in how you deal with that, but you'd have a real problem within the Islamic communities there about who is determining their religious belief. So, I mean, I suppose I'm saying here that really the only way you can properly implement, live as a Muslim community that is seeking to assert Sharia values is democratically. Yeah.
I couldn't agree more, Pak Tim. Another question is about MUI.
Can I just respond quickly to one of the questions in the chat from Abdullah Jarir, who asked me, why did I say that those who want to implement or legislate Sharia are called conservatives? I'm not saying that. Liberals also want to implement and legislate Sharia, and they have their versions. I'm not saying that. Conservatives and liberals and those in between want to implement and legislate Sharia, but they want their norms to be recognized within the state system. It's not necessarily conservative to want to legislate Sharia. What I'm saying is, and there are different versions. There are conservative versions and there are liberal versions, and there's a fight about them. What I'm saying is you have to be careful about asking the state to legislate these things, because the state will pick one version and it might not be your version. As soon as you ask the state to decide on Sharia's interpretation, someone will lose. And I think that's state capture, and that's dangerous.
Right. Thank you. About MUI, what is your opinion, Pak Tim, about the relationship between MUI and the state? Lately, we tend to be pragmatic. For example, when this, For example, when discussing the NKRI, the Unity of Indonesia, MUI is still committed to Pancasila, but when issuing a fatwa on leader, they tend to choose Muslim as leaders. I think this is counterproductive and even biased. What do you think about it?
Well, thank you very much. MUI is a very interesting organization, because if Indonesia did legislate a national mufti that had binding authority and which had a monopoly on fatwa, it would be MUI that won that position. And in some ways, it's a sort of quasi-national mufti, because it is given state authority in particular areas over time, such as Islamic banking or halal certification. It's had powers and monopolies that other Islamic organizations don't get. And also because it is sort of as I said, a quango. It's quasi-state. It receives money from the state. It works with the state, and the government actually calls it a partner. So it would be the candidate, but it has not got those powers yet. It has not become a national bureaucratic agency of the state with binding powers for its fatwa, as has been the case in Malaysia and Brunei. And I think that's a very important distinction. If that happens, I think there will be big problems, because if MUI had absolute binding powers, what happens to NU and Muhammadiyah or Persis or all the other organizations?
Yeah.
So I think politically it's probably impossible for that to happen. But MUI is a creeping mufti, if you like. It expands its powers constantly through this state partnership role because it claims to be an umbrella. It claims to be an umbrella, but really it's a separate organization, even though its members overlap. The trajectory, the path of MUI has been very interesting, beginning as a boneka of Suharto originally, to represent the government's voice and legitimize it in the Muslim world. After Suharto's fall, it had a crisis of legitimacy when it could no longer be seen as just an agent of the state. So it invented itself as a critic of the state, and became very effective in pushing policies through the state. And now it's emerged since SBE, it's emerged as a partner of government in its third incarnation. And it's won a lot of benefits from that. So yeah, I think the relationship between MUI and the state is pragmatic, but that doesn't mean it agrees with the state all the time. It has to be critical to maintain credibility. And on some issues, of course, it has found itself in opposition with the state, for example, over the whole Ahok issue, when it took a position. So MUI is like all the other organizations in Indonesia. It's playing politics. They have to, of course. Life is politics with the government, and it's redefining its role all the time. But it's been very successful in reinventing itself as one of the most powerful Islamic organizations in Indonesia, even though it's very small.
Thank you, Pak Tim. I think this is the last question for you, because I don't want to take your time because you already 2 hours. This is about UIII. UIII. So one of the mandate of the UIII is to promote Indonesian Islam. And you mentioned on your lecture that Indonesia's example on the limit of the involvement of government in the implementation Sharia is quite exemplary and be a good example for others. So would you elaborate what is good for the future of IIIU for their Islamic studies in relation to the Islamic law and society in Southeast Asia?
I'll give you a rather strange answer, which is, first of all, very few Muslims around the world outside Indonesia ever look to Indonesia as an example. Indonesia is considered generally to be on the periphery.
Right.
And also because Indonesia's reputation for a long time was of dominance of unorthodox or less orthodox or less pious forms of Islam. Historically true. Now, I think that's a challenge for Universitas Islam Internasional Indonesia because the future of education depends a lot on international education. And if you can create a high quality, intellectually strong University of Islamic Studies in Indonesia, you should be looking at an audience beyond Jakarta, beyond Bandung, beyond Java, beyond Indonesia. You should be looking right around the Muslim world for students. But you need to do better at promoting Indonesia's reputation as a hub of Islamic thought, which it is. There's no question in my mind that if you look for live, complex, contested debates about Islam, Fiki, and so forth in Southeast Asia, you will find it in Indonesia, because Indonesia's Islam has not been captured by the state. So it's vibrant and alive, but I don't think that's very well understood, not even in Southeast Asia.
Right.
So I think it is about aggressively promoting the reality of Islamic society and intellectual life in Indonesia to the rest of the world, to change Indonesia's image, to attract international students, not just because they bring money, but because that makes you part of a wider umat. And as a powerful defining figure as a high-level university within that umat, not just an interesting spark on the periphery, but as part of a network that feeds right through this umat. And it is about intellectual debate. That's the core of it. It's not real. It's not about government policies. It's not about this law or that law. It's about the depth of theological debate and the extent to which real argument between people of opposing views can be carried on. The fact that you can have a debate about Islamic feminism, and you can have really impressive scholars who are pious Muslims representing positions for and against Islamic feminism, and they can have a very good argument in a public forum without difficulty, and there can be controversial topics discussed. That's something that's very, very difficult to do in the same way that you can do it in Indonesia. But the catch is, you need to, language is a problem. To show how good Indonesian Islamic intellectual life is, it needs to be more easily accessed in the two great languages of the rest of the world for you, which are English and Arabic. Arabic because it's Islamic, English because unfortunately that's the way the world is.
Yeah.
And to change your image, you really need to promote the intellectualism that you can achieve in those languages as well as Indonesian. Indonesian is a great language. I wish I could speak it better. It's a beautiful language.
You speak brilliantly in Indonesian, Pak Tim.
Lumayan buat sehari-hari. But English is one.
Yeah, go ahead, Pak Tim.
Jamari, I have a question. Probably can be in what WhatsApp, please.
All right. Okay. Yeah. Continue, Pak Tim. Do you want to say something?
Yeah. Just you need to be a global university is my answer. To succeed domestically, you need to be global, and that means promoting Indonesian intellectual debate in the Islamic world. And it means also engaging with international students, yes, for money, but also because you are part of a wider world and you need to be contributing to it. And Indonesia needs to be recognized for its importance. It's not, unfortunately, in the Islamic world, given the recognition it should have.
All right. One more question, Pak Tim. What is the cause of the problem of the understudied of Indonesia? It is because of us who do not publicly acknowledge and also promote our advantage, or other words, undermine that we are not true Muslim.
I think it's just image.
Yeah.
I think people who are not experienced and know Indonesia tend to receive cliche about Indonesia, which is from Orba period or earlier. And so you have images of Indonesia as backward, as not orthodox, and as not important in the wider Islamic world. None of those things are true, but they're the images for people who don't know Indonesia. I don't think Indonesia is understudied. I think Australia is understudied. Nobody studies my country. I have all your PhD students come from Indonesia to Australia, and what do they do their PhD on? They don't do it on Australia. They do it on Indonesia.
Yeah.
I don't think Indonesia is understudied. I think Indonesia's image, however, needs to be more accurate and needs to be promoted more broadly. And that is, I think, a mandate for UIII. As a global university, you're not just going to be a university of excellence in Indonesia, you have to be a global university of excellence. That will take, if you can do that, then your domestic standing will be automatic.
Thank you, Pak Tim. I think it's time to end our webinar. It's very interesting. There are still a lot of questions. Some of them sent to my private WhatsApp, but because of the time, so thank you, Pak Tim, for your interesting and intriguing lectures, and also stimulating, inspiring lectures, and also encouraging to our International Islamic University here in Indonesia. Your conclusion that the limit of involvement of the government on the Sharia actually provide a vibrant and productive discussion on intellectual discourse on Sharia and Islam in Indonesia and the world. And I think that's what people don't understand about the position of Indonesia. So thank you for that, Pak Tim. Now I return it back to Sari to close.
Just before you do that, but I just want to say thank you very much for having me. It's great to see so many friends who I haven't seen for a long time, and I wish you the very best with this university. And I look forward to seeing my friends all again when the pandemic is over.
Right. Yes, and we are very happy that you'll be in our team for the future, Pak Tim.
Tim.
Yeah, team. Yeah. Okay. Next to you, Sari.
Okay, thank you, Professor Jamhari, for having chaired this webinar session. To all panelists, before we end our webinar, let's take some pictures together. I will count 1 and 2, and you guys must be ready. Pak Dadang?
Yeah.
1, 2. One, 2.
Yes, done.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you all. Again, our gratitude should go to Professor Tim Lindsay for his amazing and brilliant lecture. Also, our appreciate very much to all participants for joining us. See you in the next webinar. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam.
Prof. Tim.
Makasih Pak Tim.
Pak Tim,
Terima kasih
allow me to
banyak.
ask one question, short question, Pak Tim, if you have time.
Yes, Pak Koma.
Okay. Well, there are so many centers of the Islamic studies in the world.